The sky turned green at 4:47 in the afternoon. Not grey, not dark. Green, the color the Oklahoma sky gets when it has already made up its mind about what it's going to do to you. And standing in the middle of that open field, with a rope in her hands and a terrified horse refusing to move, was a woman who had already lost everything once and was not about to lose again. She didn't run for the shelter. She didn't drop the rope. She pulled. What happened in the next 11 minutes on that ranch? I'm going to tell you every single second of it, because this story deserves to be told right. But before we get there, I need to ask you something. If you found a horse that had been abandoned, starving, left behind like it didn't matter, and the only way to save it was to stand your ground in the path of one of the most violent storms of the decade, would you stay? Or would you run? Because she stayed. And what that cost her, and what it gave her, is the kind of thing that changes a person permanently. Hit that like button right now if you believe some things are worth fighting for, even when the sky is screaming at you to give up. Subscribe so you don't miss stories like this one, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to know where in this world real people are still watching real stories. Now, let's go back to Grady County, Oklahoma, to a piece of land called the Alderman Ranch, and to a woman named Cecile. The land in that part of Oklahoma doesn't soften itself for anyone. It stretches out flat and wide and unforgiving in every direction, the kind of landscape that looks simple from a distance and reveals its hardness only once you've committed to living on it. The grass goes yellow by July. The wind never completely stops, not even in winter, not even at night. And the sky out there is enormous in a way that city people genuinely cannot prepare for. It doesn't sit above you. It surrounds you. It presses down. In spring, it reminds you regularly that it can take everything you've built in under 2 minutes. Cecile Alderman had been living on that land for 19 years. She came to it as a bride, 24 years old, her whole life packed into 2 suitcases and a cardboard box of kitchen things she'd been collecting since she was 17. She married Dwight Alderman on a Saturday in April, in a small Baptist church on the edge of Millhaven, and they drove back to the ranch that same afternoon because the cattle still needed feeding, regardless of the occasion. That was the first thing she learned about her husband. He was a man who understood that the land did not pause for ceremony. She loved him for it eventually. It took about 6 months. They built something real out there. Not glamorous. Nothing about a working cattle ranch in central Oklahoma is glamorous, but real, solid. They raised 2 children, repaired the same fence line 4 times in 8 years, lost a barn to a fire in 2009, rebuilt it by Christmas. They had arguments that lasted 3 days and reconciliations that lasted 30 seconds because there was always too much work to sustain either one for long. They had a life. Dwight died on a Thursday in November, 4 years before this story begins. Heart attack. He was out checking the east pasture fence and he simply stopped. By the time Cecile found him, the sun was already going down. She sat with him in the grass for a long time before she called anyone. She said later that she needed those last quiet minutes with him before the world got loud again. It got loud fast. The paperwork, the decisions, the well-meaning neighbors with their casseroles and their gently phrased suggestions that maybe it was time to think about selling. Her son Miles, who lived in Tulsa and worked in insurance, drove out every other weekend for the first 2 months. Her daughter Petra, who was in nursing school in Oklahoma City, called every single day without fail for 6 weeks straight. They meant well. They both did. But they also both, in their own careful ways, expected her to fold. She didn't fold. She hired one part-time hand, a quiet, reliable young man named Cody, who was 19 and had grown up on a neighboring property and knew cattle work the way some kids know video games, completely, instinctively, without having to think about it. Between the 2 of them, they kept the Alderman Ranch running, not thriving, not growing, but running, which is its own kind of victory when you're doing it alone. Cecile was 51 years old when the spring of that particular year arrived. She had grey, threaded through brown hair that she kept in a braid most days, hands that were rougher than most men's hands she knew, and a way of looking at a problem, any problem, that was quiet and methodical and completely without panic. People in Millhaven described her the same way they described the land itself: steady, hard to move, worth knowing. The horse appeared on the first Tuesday of April. Cecile was driving the ranch truck along the county road that bordered the south edge of her property when she saw it, standing on the wrong side of the fence line that marked the old Ketterman place, which had been empty for 2 years since the Ketterman family packed up and moved to Arizona. The horse was a bay gelding, maybe 15 hands, with a winter coat still coming off in patches, and ribs you could count from 20 feet away. He was standing absolutely still in the dead grass, his head low, not grazing. There wasn't much to graze on. Just standing there the way animals sometimes stand when they've given up on expecting anything good to happen. Cecile stopped the truck. She sat there for a full minute, engine running, looking at him through the windshield. Then she got out. She didn't approach him fast. That was the first thing. She understood horses well enough to know that a frightened, depleted animal needed to be given the illusion of choice. You didn't walk straight at them. You walked near them at an angle, letting them watch you from the corner of their eye, letting them decide you were probably not going to make things worse. She talked while she walked. Nothing in particular. Just words, low and even, the way you'd talk to someone who's had a terrible day and doesn't need advice, just needs to hear a calm voice. She told him about the weather. She told him the grass was going to come in better once they got some rain. She told him she wasn't in a hurry. He let her get within 6 feet before he shifted his weight back. She stopped, waited. He dropped his head again. She stood there for 20 minutes. By the end of it, he had taken 2 steps toward her, and she had touched his nose briefly, just the back of her knuckles, nothing grabby, nothing that demanded anything. And he had not pulled away. She drove back to the ranch and returned 20 minutes later with a lead rope, a bucket of senior feed she kept for the older cattle, and a plan that she hadn't fully worked out yet, but that she was committed to anyway. It took her most of that afternoon to get the lead rope on him. Not because he was aggressive, he wasn't. He was just cautious, with the specific caution of an animal that has been let down by people before and hasn't yet received enough evidence to update that conclusion. She worked through it patiently. Every time he stepped away, she released pressure. Every time he held still, she rewarded him with a handful of feed or a scratch along the crest of his neck, where the muscles were knotted from tension. At 5:30 in the afternoon, he walked out through the gap in the fence line beside her, matching her pace, his nose at her shoulder, like he'd decided this was probably the right direction to go. She put him in the round pen and called the county livestock authority to report a found horse. Standard procedure. They told her they'd look into it. She didn't hear back for 4 days, at which point a very apologetic woman in the county office told her that the horse appeared to have belonged to a man in the Ketterman family, a younger son who had moved to Tucson ahead of the rest of the family and apparently forgotten in some fashion that the county office was careful not to editorialize about, that he had left an animal behind. The family had been contacted. They weren't coming back for him. Nobody was filing paperwork. Technically, the horse was considered abandoned. The county wanted to know what she'd like to do. Cecile thought about it for about 4 seconds. "I'll keep him," she said. She named him Gale. Not after anything in particular, just a word that felt right for something that had been through rough weather and was still standing. Cody thought she was adding unnecessary complication to an already demanding operation. He said so exactly once, in his polite, slightly formal 19-year-old way, and she listened to him carefully, and then said that he was probably right, but that they were keeping the horse anyway, and that was the end of that conversation. Over the following 3 weeks, Gale began to change in the way that neglected animals change when consistent care is applied. Slowly at first, then faster, like something thawing. His coat started coming in better. He stopped standing with his head down all the time. He began to nicker when he heard Cecile's truck coming down the ranch road. which is a small thing and also a very large thing, depending on what you understand about horses. She didn't ride him. Not yet. He wasn't ready and she wasn't in a hurry. She worked him on the lunge line in the round pen for 20 minutes each morning, let him spend his afternoons in the south pasture with good spring grass coming in, gave him senior feed and a joint supplement and the kind of daily, unhurried attention that costs nothing except time and intent. He was not a beautiful horse in the conventional sense. His knees were a little thick, probably from old injuries. His mane was unruly. He had a white sock on only one foot, which Cody pointed out was an odd marking, and Cecile said she thought it gave him character. Miles drove out in mid-April and stood at the fence of the south pasture watching Gale move and said, carefully, because he had inherited his mother's directness along with enough of his father's practicality to know when to be diplomatic, "Mom, what exactly is the plan here?" "The plan is to give him a good life," Cecile said. Miles opened his mouth, thought better of it, and went inside to make sandwiches. Petra called that evening. "Miles says you got a horse." "I got a horse. A rescue. An abandoned horse. There's a distinction." Petra was quiet for a moment. "Are you doing okay, Mom? Like, actually okay?" "I'm doing fine. I'm doing better than fine." A pause. "He nickered at me today when I brought his bucket out." Another silence. Then, "Okay, good. That's okay." Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that Cecile had been moving through the 4 years since Dwight's death with a kind of controlled, forward-facing composure that was admirable and possibly, in some complicated way, also a form of armor, and that a half-starved bay gelding standing in a dead field might have, for the first time, gotten through a joint in that armor that grief counseling and casseroles and well-meaning visits had never quite found. The sky in late April in Oklahoma is beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. It builds storms that meteorologists track with real respect. It produces tornadoes that are not metaphorical. They are physical, documented, violent acts of atmosphere that take what's in front of them and redistribute it across the countryside without sentiment or preference. The National Weather Service had been watching a system building over the Texas Panhandle for 3 days. By the morning of April 29th, they were no longer watching it. They were warning about it. The warning came through at 7:14 in the morning, a text alert. The kind that makes your phone sound like a civil defense siren, even on silent mode. Cecile was already in the barn doing morning chores. She read the alert standing in the alley between the stalls, her rubber boots in the straw, a coffee cup in her free hand. Tornado watch in effect until 8 p.m. CDT. Conditions favorable for the development of strong and violent tornadoes throughout Grady County and surrounding areas. Residents should monitor conditions throughout the day and be prepared to take immediate shelter. She read it twice. Then she put her phone back in her jacket pocket and finished filling the water buckets. Cody arrived at 8 and they talked it over the way working people talk over weather, practically, without drama. They went through the checklist that Dwight had originally written out years ago and that Cecile had updated twice since then. The cattle in the north pasture were already near the low ground by the creek bed, which was the best natural shelter the property offered. The equipment was in the main barn, which was a 1990s steel frame building and not going anywhere short of a direct strike. The emergency kit in the storm cellar had been restocked in February. Gale was in the south pasture. The south pasture was the most exposed piece of ground on the property. Flat, open, no tree line, no natural low point. In ordinary bad weather, that was fine. In a tornado, it was the worst possible place for an animal to be. "I'll bring him into the barn this morning," Cecile said. "Well before anything develops." Cody nodded. "I'll check the cellar." The morning passed without incident. The sky was overcast but ordinary. The flat grey of an April overcast. Nothing alarming. The weather radio murmured from its place on the kitchen counter, updating every 30 minutes, each update slightly more pointed than the last. Conditions remain favorable. Shear increasing. Watch continues. At noon, The watch was upgraded to a warning for the southern portion of Grady County. Cecile was at the kitchen table eating lunch when the tone changed on the weather radio. That specific three-note alert that means the situation is no longer theoretical. She stood up before the announcement even finished. She looked out the window. The sky to the southwest had taken on a particular quality of light that she recognized from 40 years of living in Oklahoma. Not darkness exactly, a kind of suppression of the light, like something large was sitting on top of it, and a color at the edge, greenish, yellowish, the color that doesn't appear in any other context, the color that means the atmosphere is doing something it very rarely does. She grabbed the lead rope off the hook by the back door. Cody was in the barn running a water hose. She stopped in the doorway. "Get yourself to the cellar." He looked up. "What about you?" "Gail's still in the south pasture." Cody set down the hose. "I'll come with you." "No!" She said it without sharpness, just finality. "I need you in the cellar. If something goes wrong, somebody has to be able to make the calls that need making. That's you." He was 22 now. He'd had a birthday in February, and he was young enough that his instinct was still to argue, but old enough to understand that she was right. He looked at her for a moment, his jaw working slightly. "5 minutes," he said. "You're not back in 5 minutes. I'll be back." She was already moving. The walk to the south pasture is normally 3 minutes at a comfortable pace. She covered it in 90 seconds, lead rope in her hand, head down against a wind that had shifted and freshened in the last 5 minutes to something that felt intentional, pressurized, like a held breath beginning to release. Gale was at the far end of the pasture. Of course he was. He was standing against the south fence looking southwest, his ears fully forward. He could feel it before she could see it. Horses read atmospheric pressure the way humans read facial expressions, instinctively, involuntarily. And what he was feeling was coming from the southwest, and it was very bad. She called to him. He turned his head but didn't move toward her. She started toward him, keeping her voice steady, her walk purposeful but not alarmed. Hey, I'm here. Let's go, sweet boy. Let's go right now." He tossed his head, stepped sideways along the fence. His eyes were white-rimmed, not from her, but from whatever the sky was telling him. She was 20 feet away when she looked up. The rotation was already visible. It was still distant, maybe 4 miles to the southwest, maybe a little more. But it was organized and lowering, the cloud base dropping in a spiral that was unmistakable once you'd seen it once in your life, and she had seen it 3 times before. The funnel wasn't fully formed, but the wall cloud beneath it was enormous, darker than the surrounding sky, rotating with a deliberateness that made the stomach drop the way looking over a cliff does. Not because you're going to fall, but because you understand the physics of it in your body before your mind catches up. The roar was starting, not loud yet, but present, that low directional sound, like a freight train that hasn't arrived, but is definitely coming. She kept walking toward Gale. He was in full flight response mode now, body tense, weight shifted back, every muscle saying run. But he was against the fence, and he had nowhere to go, and his instincts were at war with each other. This is the most dangerous moment with a frightened horse, when they can't run and they can't think. They sometimes strike or bolt sideways with enough force to put a person on the ground. Cecile understood this. She had understood it before she took the first step into that pasture. She kept her body at an angle, her eyes slightly averted, non-threatening posture, even now, even in this. And she spoke in the same even tone she'd used the very first day she'd found him in the dead grass on the wrong side of the Ketterman fence line. Just words, just a calm voice in a world that had gone loud and frightening. I know it's bad. But I'm here, and we're going to go together, and you have to trust me. That's all. Just trust me." She got the lead rope on him on the first try. He leaned back against it immediately, all 1,200 pounds of him, and for a moment she thought she might simply be lifted off her feet. She braced, dug in, held. The rope went bar-tight between them. "No," she said, just that, firm and clear. He didn't settle. Nothing was going to make him settle, not with that sky. But he stopped actively pulling. He stood there trembling, and she took one step toward the gate, and then she waited, and then he took one step with her. That's how they moved across that pasture. One step, wait, one step. The lead rope tight between them, her arm aching, the wind building to something serious now, debris beginning to move at the edges of her vision. A piece of plastic feed bag tumbling across the grass, a branch skidding end over end. She had gotten maybe 40 yards when the funnel touched down. She heard it more than saw it. The sound changed in a way that is impossible to describe accurately to someone who hasn't heard it. It went from a roar to something else, something that isn't a sound so much as a pressure, a frequency that you feel in your sternum and your back teeth simultaneously. And she knew from that sound that it was on the ground and that it was moving, and that the distance between her and the barn gate was very, very important. She stopped trying to be gentle. She didn't yank the rope. She knew better than to do that. But she shortened it, brought Gail's head around toward her shoulder, and she moved. Not running, you can't run next to a 1,000-pound animal on a lead rope without creating disaster, but walking fast, purposefully, her shoulder against his neck, her body communicating through contact rather than just rope. This way now. I'm not stopping. Come with me. Something extraordinary happened. He came with her. Not calmly. He was shaking, snorting, his hooves occasionally scrambling for purchase on the grass as the wind gusted hard enough to shift both of them sideways. But he came. He matched her pace. His nose stayed at her shoulder. She focused on the barn gate. Just the gate. 40 yards, then 30, then 20. The roar behind her was enormous. She did not look back. There is something that happens to people in genuine crisis, not in the movies but in real life, that almost nobody talks about afterward, because it's hard to explain without sounding like you're being dramatic. Time doesn't slow down exactly, but your attention narrows to such a specific point that everything outside that point ceases to exist in any practical sense. There is no past. There is no future. There is only the 12 feet of space in front of you and the thing you are trying to accomplish within it. Cecile was not thinking about Dwight. She was not thinking about Miles or Petra. She was not thinking about the cattle in the north pasture or the equipment in the barn or the house that she and Dwight had spent 19 years filling with life. She was thinking about the gate latch, which she knew sometimes stuck in cold weather and she needed it to open on the first try. And she was thinking about the angle she'd need to bring Gail through the gate without him catching his hip on the post, because a frightened horse going through a gate too fast could spin, and the post would stop him, and she'd lose her grip. And then they'd have a loose horse in an open field with a tornado on the ground, and that was not acceptable. She reached the gate. Her hand found the latch. It opened on the first try. She walked Gail through at an angle, his hip clearing the post by 4 inches, and then she was in the lane between the pasture and the barn, which had a windbreak of old cedar trees on one side, and the cedar trees were doing things cedar trees do not normally do, bending, twisting, some of them losing whole limbs that cartwheeled away into the grey-green air. But the lane itself was 15 feet of relative shelter, and she used every inch of it. 40 yards to the barn, then 30. Then the hail started. It came without warning, not the gentle patter that usually precedes it, but instantly, violently, golf ball sized and falling at an angle, because the wind was doing things that made straight down a theoretical direction. It hit the lane, it hit the cedar trees, it hit Cecile's back and shoulders and the crown of her head with a force that made her gasp, and then immediately clench her jaw and keep moving. Gail screamed, a sound she'd never heard from him before, high and desperate, and he reared up, his front hooves leaving the ground. She had the presence of mind to let the rope slide through her hands rather than resist, letting his head come up without the rope snapping tight and dragging him down. And then, as his front feet came back down, she was already moving in close, her hand on his neck, her voice right at his ear. "I have you. I have you. Keep going." She found out later that Cody had been watching from the barn door. He had waited at the cellar entrance until he saw her come through the pasture gate with Gale, and then he had come out, disregarding her explicit instruction, which she couldn't be angry about, not really. And he had the barn door open, and he stood in the doorway with his arm out like a guide in a darkness. She saw him at 15 yards. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She just kept walking. They made it into the barn at 4:58 in the afternoon. Cecile got Gale into his stall, clipped the lead to the tie ring, and then she put both hands on the stall door, and she breathed. Just breathed. Her back was on fire from the hail. Her hands were shaking badly. Not fear exactly, or not only fear. The come down from that level of adrenaline is physical, profound. The body arguing with itself about what just happened. "Go," she said to Cody. "Cellar, now. You? I'll be right behind you." 30 seconds. He went. She stood in Gale's stall for those 30 seconds. The barn was metal, and it was conducting the sound of the storm in a way that was extraordinary. A constant battering roar. Hail on the roof like a sustained gunshot. The whole structure vibrating. The lights flickered and went out. The emergency light on the far wall clicked on, casting everything in a pale, flat white. Gale was shaking. She put her hand on his neck and she kept it there. His skin was moving beneath her palm with the tremor of it. This animal that had been abandoned and starved and left in a dead field and had still somehow found enough trust to walk with her through the worst 11 minutes of both their lives. She said quietly, "You did good. You were so good." He dropped his head slightly. Just slightly. She turned and walked to the cellar. The storm cellar under the Alderman Ranch house was an older structure. Poured concrete single bulkhead door, 6 steps down into a space roughly the size of a large walk-in closet. There were 2 metal folding chairs, a plastic bin of supplies, a battery-powered radio, and a flashlight that Cody had already turned on when she came down the steps. She pulled the bulkhead shut behind her and threw the interior bolt. Cody was already on the radio, adjusting the dial, finding the emergency broadcast. She sat down in the other folding chair and became aware for the first time that she was soaking wet. The hail had melted where it hit her, and she was completely soaked through, her jacket heavy with it, her boots squishing. She became aware of something else too. Her left hand was bleeding. She hadn't noticed, she hadn't felt it. Not with everything else, but there was a cut along the outer edge of her palm where the lead rope had run through her grip when Gale reared, a friction burn and a deeper cut where the metal snap had caught her. It wasn't serious. It was oozing rather than bleeding in any alarming way. She wrapped it in a rag from the supply bin and held pressure without thinking much about it. The radio found signal. Tornado confirmed on the ground, moving northeast at approximately 35 miles per hour, producing significant damage in western portions of Grady County. Residents in the path should be in substantial shelter immediately. This is a confirmed violent tornado, rated EF3, at minimum on initial assessment, EF3. Cecile closed her eyes briefly. An EF3 tornado produces winds between 136 and 165 miles per hour. It removes roofs from well-constructed houses. It destroys interior walls. It moves large vehicles. In the context of a working cattle ranch, a 1990s steel frame barn, a wood frame farmhouse built in the 1970s, a round pen, fence lines and equipment shed, the word EF3 is not an abstraction. She thought about Gale in his stall, tied to the ring she'd clipped him to. She thought about the cattle in the north pasture. She thought very briefly about the house. Then she focused on the radio, because focusing on the radio was the only productive thing available to her. And Cecile Alderman had always been a woman who identified the productive thing and focused on it. Cody was quiet beside her. He was 22. And he had grown up in this county, and he understood tornadoes the way she did, respectfully, without romanticism. He had his hands on his knees, and he was listening. The sound above them was indescribable. She had been in a cellar during a tornado twice before, once when she was a girl at her aunt's house in Chickasha, And once in 2011, the bad year for Oklahoma storms, when she and Dwight had sat in this very cellar for 40 minutes and come out to find the equipment shed on its side and the old cottonwood tree in the front yard simply gone, extracted from the earth as cleanly as a pulled tooth. This was louder than 2011. It was the kind of loud that becomes physical. You feel it in your ribcage, in the sinus cavities behind your forehead. The bulkhead door rattled in its frame with a violence that should not have been possible for a bolted door. Dust came through cracks she hadn't known were there. The flashlight flickered once. She put her hand on Cody's arm, not for her own reassurance. She genuinely did not think about it that way, just so he'd know she was there. The loudest part lasted somewhere between 45 seconds and 2 minutes. She didn't time it. It was the kind of duration that resists being measured because you stop tracking time and simply endure it, 1 second dissolving into the next. And then it changed. Not gone, not immediately, but it shifted. The pressure differential reversed, and the rattling of the door became less catastrophic and became merely alarming, and then merely loud, and then merely present. The sound retreating northeast across the county the way the broadcast had said it would, 35 miles per hour toward the next person's land, the next person's barn, the next person's life. They waited 10 minutes after the sound had fully faded. That's what you do. The 10 minutes after feels longer than the storm itself. Cody said quietly, "You ready?" "Yeah." She unbolted the bulkhead and pushed it open. The first thing she registered was the sky. It had changed entirely, the way it does after a violent storm passes, going from that horrifying green to a pale, washed-out grey-yellow that has a kind of exhausted clarity to it, like something that has finished being terrible and is now just weather again. The second thing she registered was the house. It was standing. The porch roof on the east side had collapsed. Several windows were blown out. There was debris, insulation, pieces of wood, a segment of fence rail, someone else's lawn chair embedded halfway into the front yard, scattered across the property in the way that tornadoes scatter things, which is to say, without logic, without preference, with a randomness that feels almost contemptuous. But the house was standing. She turned toward the barn. The barn was standing. She started walking. Then she was running, which she never did. She had not run, she realized, in years, not actually run the way you run when something matters. And she covered the distance to the barn in seconds, and she threw the door open and she looked into the pale emergency light interior. Gale was in his stall. He was standing, all 4 feet. The lead was still clipped to the tie ring. He was facing the door, facing her, and his ears came forward when she appeared. He nickered. That was it. That was all. A quiet, low nicker, the sound a horse makes when it sees someone it associates with good things, when it recognizes the person who brings the feed bucket, and the calm voice and the hand along the crest of the neck. Cecile put her hands over her face. She stood there in the doorway of her barn, on the land she and Dwight had spent 19 years working, while a pale, exhausted sky stretched out in every direction and debris from someone else's somewhere else decorated her fences and yard. And she let herself, just for a minute, just for 1 minute, not be steady. Cody appeared beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. After a minute, she dropped her hands. Her face was wet. She wiped it with the back of her wrist. The clean wrist, not the one with the cut, and she walked into the barn, and she unclipped the lead from the tie ring, and she let Gale put his heavy, warm nose against her chest. "Okay," she said, to him, to herself, to Dwight maybe, wherever that means. Okay. The damage assessment took 3 days. The east porch roof was a complete loss and would need to be rebuilt. 6 sections of fence line were gone. 2 of them in the north pasture, where the cattle had sheltered by the creek bed, all of which came through without injury, a fact that Cecile described later as the one part of this that makes complete sense, because cattle are smarter than people give them credit for. The equipment shed had lost its east wall. 3 of the cedar trees in the windbreak lane were down, which made her sadder than the shed did. Those trees were old, planted by the previous owner, And there was something about old trees that makes their absence feel like a subtraction from history. The barn had damage to the roof at the northeast corner, a section of steel roofing peeled back like a lid, but the structure was sound and the stalls were intact. Miles drove out the day after the storm. He walked the property with Cecile in silence, taking photographs for the insurance claim on his phone, and at one point he stopped and looked at the south pasture, at the open, exposed ground, the gate she'd brought Gail through, and he said, carefully, "You went back out there to get him." "I did. During an EF3. The funnel hadn't touched down yet when I went out." "But you didn't know that." She considered that for a moment. "No, I didn't." Miles looked at his phone. Then at the pasture. Then at his mother. He was 31 years old, and he looked, in that moment, exactly like his father at the same age, which she felt in the specific location in her chest where Dwight still lived. "Okay," he said. Finally, just that. The insurance adjuster arrived on day 2. A man named Gordon, thorough and not unkind, who walked the property with a clipboard and took measurements and photographs and told her at the end that the claim would likely cover the porch and the equipment shed and most of the fence repair, though the timeline for processing would be several weeks. She thanked him and offered him coffee, which he declined. And that was that. Cody came every day, same as always. He was quieter than usual for the first week. On the 4th day, he said, while they were doing morning chores, "I watched you the whole time from the cellar entrance before you told me to go in." He didn't look at her while he said it. "I watched you walk back into that pasture and I didn't know—" He stopped. "But I came back," she said. "Yeah, so—" He nodded. She handed him a feed bucket. Petra called every day, which was not unusual. On the first call, when Cecile had described the sequence of events, including the south pasture and the hail and the EF3 rating, there had been a silence on the line that lasted long enough that Cecile said, "Petra, you still there?" And Petra said, "Mom, I love you so much, and I need you to know that I think you're completely insane." Cecile had laughed, properly laughed, for the first time in she wasn't sure how long. Gail recovered from the storm the way horses recover from most things, quickly, without apparent reflection, because horses live in the present tense in a way that humans find both enviable and slightly baffling. By the second day after the tornado, he was back in the south pasture in the afternoon, grazing on the spring grass, his coat catching the light, his tail moving lazily at the insects, as if the previous Thursday had simply not occurred in any personal history he was maintaining. The cut on Cecile's hand healed cleanly. She had it looked at by her doctor, Ada, in Millhaven the morning after the storm. Ada had been her doctor for 14 years and barely reacted to the story beyond, "You should really have this cleaned properly, and I'm going to need you to promise me something," which was that if there was ever a next time, and the tornado was confirmed on the ground before she went out, she would make a different decision. Cecile promised. Whether she meant it was a question Ada was wise enough not to investigate, the porch roof was rebuilt by mid-May. The fence went up the following week. The cedar trees that had fallen were cleared and stacked for firewood, and she replanted 2 saplings along the windbreak, understanding that she would not live to see them reach the size of what had been lost, and planting them anyway. Summer came to Grady County the way it always does, gradually and then completely, the temperature rising in increments until one morning you step outside and the air hits you like a warm, wet wall, and you know that spring is over and it is time to simply endure. Cecile rode Gail for the first time in the first week of June. She hadn't planned a specific date for it. She wasn't that kind of person, the kind who puts milestones on the calendar and works toward them with ceremony. She had simply been aware, over the weeks since the storm, that something in him had shifted. The caution was still there, but it had become— She looked for the right word and landed on considered. Considered rather than reflexive. He was still watchful. He was just no longer afraid. She brought him to the round pen one morning with the saddle, and stood for a while just letting him smell it, letting him process the weight of it on his back the first time she lifted it up, keeping everything slow and conversational in that non-verbal way they'd established between them. He stood quietly for the girth, quietly for the bridle. When she swung up and settled her weight in the saddle, he stood with his ears tilted back toward her, listening, not bracing, and waited. She asked him to walk. He walked. They went around that round pen for 20 minutes, and then she opened the gate, and they went out into the lane, and then, gradually, through the gate into the south pasture, the same ground she had crossed with a lead rope, while the sky came apart. And they walked across it in the morning light, the grass deep and green from a wet May, the air still cool, the shadows long. She didn't try to describe what that felt like. Not to Miles, not to Petra, not to Cody, who was watching from the fence, with his arms folded, and something that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction on his face. She kept it for herself, the way you keep certain things for yourself, because sharing them would require a precision of language that doesn't exist, and the attempt would only make them smaller. Nolan Reyes, a reporter from the Millhaven Gazette who had been covering the storm damage across the county, came out to the Alderman Ranch in late June to do a piece on property recovery. He was 26 and eager and had a good instinct for what made a story. And he had heard from someone in the county office, who had heard from someone else, about a woman who had gone out into the path of an EF3 to get her horse. He asked Cecile if she'd be willing to talk about it. She agreed, with some reluctance. She sat with him at the kitchen table and told him the straightforward version, the one without the interior material, the one that was just the facts in sequence. He wrote it up well. The piece ran on a Thursday in late June. It was shared on social media an embarrassing number of times, which she found out from Petra, who found the whole thing delightful and read her the comments on the phone until Cecile told her to please stop. Most of the comments were some version of, why didn't she just leave the horse and get to safety? She understood why people asked that. She did. People who hadn't met Gale, who didn't know the specific quality of the morning he'd first walked up and put his nose against her knuckles, who hadn't been there in the stall when he dropped his head and let her breathe. Those people would always see the logic of the question. A horse is a horse. Shelter is shelter. The math is simple. The math was never the point. There was an evening in late July when Cecile took Gale out past the south pasture, through the back gate, out onto the open country beyond the ranch boundary, where the land rolls slightly, the first topography you encounter after miles of flat, and they moved through it at an easy canter in the fading light. The grass was gold, the shadows were long. The sky above them was the clean, uncomplicated blue of a midsummer Oklahoma evening, a color so deep and honest it almost hurt to look at. She let him move. She stayed out of his way. He ran the way a horse runs when it has chosen to, not away from something, not because it's frightened, but because the ground is good and the air is good, and somewhere in its old and uncomplicated heart it knows that this is what it was made to do. She thought, this is the plan. People ask me sometimes why I tell stories like this one, and I think the honest answer is because the world keeps presenting us with the same question, dressed up in different clothes, in different landscapes, on different days. The question is always some version of when it costs you something real, when the sky is green and the roar is starting and the sensible thing is to drop the rope and run. What do? Cecile didn't drop the rope, not because she was reckless. Not because she didn't understand the danger, she understood it completely, with the clear-eyed, practical intelligence of a woman who had spent her life on land that didn't apologize for anything. She went back out into that pasture because a horse that had been abandoned once, that had stood alone in a dead field, head down, waiting for nothing, was not going to be abandoned again. Not on her watch, not while she still had a rope in her hands and 2 legs under her. That's it. That's the whole calculation, simple and enormous at the same time. There's something she said to Nolan, the reporter, that he didn't end up using in the article because it didn't fit the structure he was working with. but that I think about." He had asked her, at the end of the interview, almost as an afterthought, whether she'd been afraid. She'd been quiet for a moment. "Of course I was afraid," she said. "But I've been afraid before. Being afraid doesn't mean you stop. If this story gave you something today, a feeling, a thought, a reason to sit with the people and animals you love a little longer tonight, then it did what it was supposed to do. Hit the like button before you go, subscribe if you haven't, and leave your city in the comments. I read them, all of them, and it means more than you know. Until next time, take care of each other, and if there's something you're supposed to hold on to, hold on.